Like the father in Jesus' story, I have two sons with the added bonus of a daughter. But unlike the sons in this story, my children could not pay for much dissolute living with their inheritance. When my first son left for college, I did not cry. I moped and I worried and I snapped at friends, but no tears. I excused myself from his dorm room shortly after Nate's new college friends arrived. It was painful to leave him, and I wanted it to be over. I remembered that Anne and I had the long drive home from Wilmie, the first 100 miles of which is absolutely empty, which is how we felt, sad, depleted, a little worried. When Nate left for his sophomore year, I fretted again. I didn't cry, but I worried and waited impatiently to hear from him. When our second son, Zachariah, went to college, I was an older and more experienced father, but leaving him in his dorm wasn't any easier. I left his dorm quickly then, too. It wasn't until Hannah, at age 20, left for Scotland that I cried. I put her on a plane twice, once in Charlotte in September and in Raleigh in January. As excited as I was for her adventure, and I was, I felt the worst I'd ever been feeling, seeing her walk through the TSA checkpoint alone. My kids, now 28, 26, and 22, have their own budding lives, and I love to be around them, and I miss them when they leave. I know how sappy that makes me, but I can't help it. Our children carry with us so many of our hopes that when they leave, they take a part of us with them. After the prodigal son leaves, his father finds a quiet place and cries because his son is taking his hopes with him. The younger son knows that he's taking his father's money, but he does not understand that he is taking his father's heart. Even when he finally came to himself, he only wants to be a hired hand. He writes a terrible speech suggesting his unworthiness to be his father's child. Jesus knows what he's talking about. He knows that God's children carry God's hopes. God's love is what makes us God's children. When we wander off, God's heart breaks a little. This is the third week of our summer sermon series, Are We There Yet? Two travel parables are unique to Luke's gospel, and this is the second travel parable found there. Hear the story again, an Aaron Sorkin version, the American screenwriter of The West Wing and A Few Good Men, written by a pastor friend of mine. A rich man has two sons who should wait for their money, but the younger one thinks, I don't have that kind of time, Daddy-o. If you haven't seen this kid play his father, then you haven't seen Shakespeare the way it was meant to be played. The father is not sure what to do, but a famous monk said, I don't always know what the right thing is to do, my lord, but the fact that I want to please you, I know pleases you. So the father gives him the inheritance, and the prodigal thinks, I'm really quite something. I could buy the biggest house in town and turn it into my ping pong room. He packs his bags and leaves for a far-off land. Where? He wastes his money. His situation will get worse before it gets better. A farmer offers him a terrible entry-level position, explaining, the work is hard and sweaty. The prodigal replies, much like myself. He takes the job feeding pigs, even as he says, I'm Jewish, and this job is incredibly not. As if it matters how a man falls down. Even when the fall is all that's left, it matters very much. Each day he says, I'm like McLovin in Superbad around here, which makes no sense to 99% of those who hear it. The son feels horrible, like his legs don't go all the way to the ground. He gets so hungry he wants to eat the pig's corn cobs. That's the cost of doing business. He finally decides to go home, though he doesn't know how his father will respond. It's 6 to 5 odds. Pick him. He's afraid his father will say, "I hate your breathing guts." But this sideshow is over. When he finally gets home, his father hugs him. When the son starts to apologize, the old man interrupts. "The only thing that you have to do to make me happy is to come home at the end of the day. Let us drink from the keg of glory. Bring the finest muffins and bagels in all the land and eat 'em up." "Dad, everyone is mad with me." "Son, I'm not other people." "But what are the neighbors going to say?" "Answer them, don't answer them. I don't care. It's entirely up to you." The older brother comes home from work, hears the commotion, asks what's going on, and is not pleased with the answer. He yells at the father, "Not for nothing, but I haven't been exactly gathering ye rosebuds here. Have you noticed that I don't act like an adolescent, oversexed whoremonger? I'm not that guy. This isn't 4-H club, this is real farm work, and you know it. This is not a proportional response." The father asks, "What's the virtue of a proportional response? I want things to be better." "Better for who?" demands the older son. "Whom? I know this is hard for you," the father says. "You think?" The older son claps back. "Son, you were always with me, to say nothing of the fact that all that is mine has always been yours. It seems to me that more and more we've come to expect less and less from each other. And I think that should change." The parable begins with these words: "There was a man who had 2 sons." There are 2 sons in the story. The parable makes the radical statement, especially radical for Jesus' time, that both sons were estranged from the father. One was a prodigal and the other was righteous. One went to a far country, the other stayed home. But they are both distant from the father. They are both alike. One is rebellious, one is self-righteous. But they are both alike. They want the same thing. They are rival for the same thing, and their behaviors, as different as they are caused by the same thing. This desperate need in their lives to hear the Father's blessing. And that is the most radical assertion made in this parable. It shocked the people in Jesus' day. The prodigality and self-righteousness are the symptoms of the same disease. And that disease is called alienation from God. And the cure for both sons is the same. It's grace. The tragedy of this story is that only one son realizes it. The older brother says, "I'm all right. There's nothing wrong with me. I stayed at home. I did what Father told me to do. Never did I imagine I would do anything like what the younger son did, so I'm different from my brother." The father was there waiting with a big sign, "Prodigal sons matter." When the older brother saw it, he was angry, wouldn't attend the party, moped around with his own sign, "All sons matter." The father said, "Dude, it's not about you right now." The younger son went to a far-off land. If you know ancient Jewish culture, you know that already the son has broken the most inviolate taboo. Jews would never leave the family and go to a Gentile country to live. They would be defiled, disgraced, and disowned. But we know it's a Gentile country in the story because there are pigs there, and that's the worst degradation of all. There would never be pigs in a Jewish country. And the worst state of all is when the younger son, finally in desperation, has to tend the pigs, which means now that he is banned, ostracized, and shunned. As far as any Jewish family in those days are concerned, the son is now dead. His memory erased from the family. He can never come home. Never. But he comes home. And not only does he come home, but the father receives him. And not only does the father receive him, he blesses him, which is the meaning of placing the robe on his shoulders and bringing a ring on his finger and the shoes upon his feet and having a party to celebrate his coming home. He has now received the one thing that all of us want more than anything else, the Father's blessing. And it was just given to him, free. He was lost and then found. My son who was dead is now alive. That is exactly why the older brother is so enraged. If anyone ever deserved a blessing, he said, it's me. I worked hard for it. I sacrificed. I didn't go across the river into the flesh pots of the Gentile country. I never did that. I stayed in the culture in which I was raised. I never questioned it. I was always faithful to it. And now, look what has happened. It's disgusting. It's immoral. That's what it is, that my brother would be treated in such a way. Go to the parable. See what happens. The younger son returns. The father gives him the robe and the ring and the party. The older son refuses to join in the party. He's standing outside on the porch. The sound of revelry coming from inside the house. He has his back turned, looking out over the property that is supposed to be all his. He won't go in the house. And you know what that means. It means that the porch has now become the far-off country. That's the point. The son is revealing by his behavior that he is as estranged from the father as was the younger son. He wants that blessing. He believes that he's earned it. It's what he wants more than anything else, and he didn't get it. And his efforts did not result in being rewarded, so he won't give in. Look what happens. Just as the father took the initiative to go down the road to greet the younger son, so the father takes the initiative to go out on the porch to meet the righteous son. As the parable puts it, his father came out and began to plead with him. A man had two sons. There is no difference. They are both estranged from the father. Both want the same thing. Both want the father's blessing more than anything else in this life. What makes the older son angry is that the younger son got it. The older son had everything else. The father said to him, everything that I have ever had is yours. But that doesn't matter. The one thing he doesn't have is the blessing, the assurance of the father's love, expressed in words or in some tangible symbol of blessing like the cloak and the ring and the party. A parent has had two kids. So the story is about us. Everybody. Riotous and righteous, holy and hell-raising, and those of us who are both. Queer and straight, religious people and secular people. It's about all of us. It's the human condition to want this blessing from parents and from God. If you are a prodigal child and you've lived in such a way that has violated the common morality, then you know what it's like to be estranged. You can articulate the feeling. And you also know what it's like to want, more than anything else, to be reconciled, to be brought back into the family and the community. And if what you have received is God's forgiveness and God's grace in your life, you know that. If you've experienced that reconciliation, then you know it is an act of grace. Even if what you've received is from another human being, if you've ever been loved unconditionally, you know what it's like to be loved by God. That's why Paul, in the Corinthian letter, says that we are all, quote, ambassadors for Christ, God making a divine appeal through us. For if we love, then others will know what God's love is like. That's what's so significant about Christians celebrating Pride this month and always. Too many queer folks feel rejected and hated by God, not realizing they are the beloved children of a good and gracious God. It's absolutely critical that we live out this radical divine love, because for centuries people have, under a false Christian flag, rejected, hated, enslaved, maimed, and killed LGBTQ folks and people of color. we can repent and do better. And if you've received that love, then you know what John Newton is talking about. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. But if you're an older child, you have trouble even saying that word, wretch, much less applying it to yourself. Because you're different. You stayed close to home. You obeyed all the rules. You resent people suggesting that there's no difference between you and him. You may not know that you feel estranged until you see that joy that enriches and enlivens the life of someone who has experienced grace in their life. And that's when you realize that you don't have it, and that you might resent it because God knows you deserve it. You've worked all of your life to get it. You don't have it and you want it more than anything else. You know what grace is. You can define it, you can point to those passages in Scripture where it appears, but you've never experienced it. Not enough to produce joy. Simple and real and uncomplicated joy in your life. So there is what you could call the righteous person's suspicion of conversion. You notice that in a lot of mainline church people. It's manifested as a kind of elitism. We don't do that. It's not our style. But along with it, I suspect there is a kind of longing and often a resentment that what they lay claim to, that we mainline church people have never experienced. A teacher every year in her 5th grade class gives what she calls the Scholastic Olympics. What happened was that she would ask each child to pick a sentence from literature, name the author and the source from which it came, then explain why the sentence could be called the best sentence ever written. You could probably guess what some of the entries were, like 7 years ago, and all people are created equal. A lot of political phrases like that. There are also a lot of literary phrases like to be or not to be. The girl who got the most points for knowing that to be or not to be was from a play got some points taken away because she said the author was the playwright of Hamilton. There were 14 entries of the same Bible verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Probably because the teacher had said that was her favorite verse. So you know what sentence 1? It wasn't written by a famous author at all. It wasn't to be found in any literary source. It was on a postcard from Hawaii that one of these 5th grade girls received from her stepfather. It was on a honeymoon with the girl's mother. The teacher was uneasy about this because the children were supposed to explain why this is the best sentence ever written. But she let the girl speak. The girl said that until she received the postcard, she didn't know how her stepfather felt about her. The girl's entry won the prize. It was written on the back of a postcard from Waikiki. It said, "Charlotte, I love you." That's the greatest sentence ever written. There are so many variations of it, and whenever it is heard, and from whatever source it comes, it constitutes a blessing from God. It is here in this text this morning. It is here in the parable of the prodigal son, and it's addressed to everyone, to both sons in the story. Are we there yet? No, not yet. To every offspring, to the prodigals and to the righteous, come home. I love you.